Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here with 3 actionable tips on how you can fatten up your metal mix. Now when it comes to having a fatter sounding mix, we pretty much all know that it has to do with low end management. In other words, fatness comes from low end. But if it were as easy as just boosting a bunch of top end on either your mix bus or on your individual instruments, everyone would have a fat mix. But instead, we hear so many muddy mixes. So what's the trick to having a super fat yet clear mix? Well, in this video, I'm gonna give you 3 tips that are so simple, but will really help you out. So I have a pretty fat sounding mix here that I'm about to play, and I'm gonna break down and share with you the 3 techniques that I used to achieve this mix. Let's check it out. So as you can hear, super fat kick drum, sounds like the guitars are fat, it's a fat mix in general, yet there's still some clarity there. And it really comes down to 3 different techniques, which I'm about to share with you. So like I previously mentioned, adding a bunch of low end to your mix bus is not the answer. Also, adding a bunch of low end to all of your individual tracks isn't the answer either. So what do? Believe it or not, the secret is to remove a bunch of low end from almost every single track in your mix, except for your kick drum and bass guitar. Think about it, when you're listening to a nice fat sounding mix, the mix sounds fat as a whole. But in reality, there are only 2, maybe 3 instruments that are taking up the majority of the super duper low end. And in this case, it all comes down to the kick drum and bass guitar, which are generally the 2 most common low-endy instruments within any rock or metal production. So like I mentioned, I'm leaving the majority of my low end to the kick and bass. And because only these 2 instruments are living in the sub-range, I can really push them pretty hard and achieve that fat sounding production as a whole. So for example, if we look at my overheads, I'm removing a bunch of low end. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty extreme here. Everything below 370 hertz on my low end is completely gone. I don't want those low end frequencies conflicting with my bass guitar or my bass drum. And the same thing goes for lead guitars. I'm really extreme here. Everything below 360 hertz has been removed. Vocals, everything below 100 hertz has been removed. Synths, everything below 310 hertz has been removed. Rhythm guitars, everything below 80 hertz. Even on my snare drum, everything below 100 hertz is rolled off. Again, with this production, I wanted a super fat, low-endy, almost dancey kind of feel. And the way I achieved this is by being ruthless with my high passing on every single track except my bass guitar and kick drum. So because only these 2 instruments are living within that low frequency range, that sub range, I could push them a little harder and my mix still sounds clear. Fat yet clear. And this brings me to tip number 2, using a brick wall limiter on your bass guitar or even your bass synth track. The reason why this is important is that using a brick wall limiter on your bass will stop your bass from having extra movement within your mix. In other words, it'll keep your bass nice and consistent. And because so much of the low frequency information is coming from your bass, that consistency will give the effect of a fatter sounding mix. So if we look at my bass track, I have a simple brick wall limiter here, and let's see what it's doing to my bass sound. So as you can tell, when you look at my bass guitar track, it's super consistent and unmoving. This consistent, unmoving signal gives the effect of a super solid fat low end. And again, because only our kick drum and bass guitar are living in that range, it gives us a super consistent low end in general. So again, if you're having issues and you feel like your mix is a little thin, and then in certain sections it's overly low endy, try using a brick wall limiter on your bass guitar. It will work wonders. And this brings me to tip number 3, which many people don't think about. If you want a fatter sounding mix, use fatter sounding drums. And to be more specific, use lower tuned drums. I'm constantly shocked at the amount of people that will send me their songs to be mixed and they'll tell me they want a super fat drum sound. But when I listen to it, their drums are tuned really high and their drummer might even be using a piccolo snare. If your drums are tuned high and you're not using a fat sounding snare drum, you're not gonna have a fat sounding drum mix. That's just the reality of it. So with that being said, let's listen to my drums in solo. So as you can tell, the snare is super fat and the kick is super fat. And this is because I spent a lot of time tuning my drums on recording day. I already knew that I wanted a fat drum sound before I even got to tracking. And the way to do this is to tune your drums when you track. Now let's say you're mixing a song that you did not record. Do not be afraid to use drum samples. Now I know there's all this misinformation online how horrible drum samples are, but engineers have been using drum samples for decades, even before DAWs existed. So don't listen to this nonsense. If you're not happy with the raw sound of your drums, use samples. Do whatever it takes to achieve the tone that you're after. So again, as an example, let's say you have a snare sound that's really thin, it's just not cutting it for you. Don't try to EQ it to hell to make it sound fatter. It's not gonna work. Take a sample and replace it, or at least use a sample to blend in with the original snare. Now in this example, I got the snare sound right at the source, but again, if I were given tracks that didn't sound right, I would not hesitate to use one of my own drum samples to get the sound that I want. Because remember, a fat drum sound is a huge part of a fat sounding mix in general. Again, these are things that might seem obvious, but people rarely think of. So just to recap, if you want a fatter sounding mix, number one, only allow 2 to 3 instruments to live in that sub-range. Doing this will allow you to push those instruments up a little more in your mix without the mix becoming muddy. Also, don't be afraid to brick wall limit your bass. You want your bass unmoving in your mix so it's nice and controlled, so the mix will still have clarity even though there's a lot of extra low end happening. And finally, use lower tuned, fatter sounding drums. Again, a huge part of any production is the drum sound. And if you have thin, super high tuned or piccolo snare or something like that, you're not gonna have a fat drum sound. It's as simple as that. So again, use fatter drum sounds or lower tuned drum sounds to help fatten up your metal mix. Now I'm curious to know, are you after a fatter sounding mix? Is this something that you often struggle with? Leave a comment in the comment section below and tell me about it. I'd love to hear your opinion. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And be sure to download my 5-step guide to better heavy mixes so you can achieve better results with the gear you have right now. There's a link below in this video's description. Download the guide for absolutely free. Till next time, happy mixing.